I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank the Hive for hosting us. This has been a very hospitable venue for us for many events, especially some of our youth advocacy programs, and we want to thank them for being such gracious hosts and opening this space up to us for tonight's event and the taping of tonight's event. So thanks to everyone from the Hive for making this possible. Sixto Cancel is the CEO and founder of Think of Us. He's also a board member of Juvenile Law Center, and we are very proud to be able to claim him as a member of our board. And this event was his idea, and we're very grateful for Sixto for all he does. He was working in the office next to me today, and it added so much energy and excitement into the office. So he just got back from Africa Sunday night. Yeah, as part of the Forbes 30 leaders.
It's Forbes under 30 under 30.
Forbes 30 under 30. And came into Philadelphia early this morning because he had a busy work day, and so he could get here on time. So thanks, Sixto. And Sixto, I think many of us, if not all of us, know his work and his visionary way of thinking about the child welfare system. And he has been so critical to Juvenile Law Center's thinking, not only because his work and what he brings to the table is so evidence and data-driven, but it is completely youth-centered, and it brings not the voice of an anecdote or a single story, but the voices of youth who are impacted by the child welfare system in not just at the table, but kind of overwhelming every conversation. And so we are so grateful for Sixto, and he will keep us honest in our work as part of our board of directors. We commit ourselves to being youth-centered and youth-driven. And we're very grateful for him for being a member of our board of directors. Dorothy Roberts is the professor of Africana Studies, Law and Sociology at UPenn. And she is a 2022 Leadership Prize Award winner. I should have mentioned that Sixto was a 2021 Leadership Prize Award winner. So we will be honoring Dorothy along with Centoya Brown-Long and Tom Grisso at our virtual Leadership Prize event on May 12th. And we hope you will all tune into that either via Facebook Live, YouTube, or Instagram, and that'll air at 7 o'clock on May 12th. Dorothy's work has really been foundational in challenging every assumption we have about the child welfare system, and I encourage all of you to read all of her books, but her most recent book, even just the title, sort of puts it all out there. You know, how the child welfare system destroys Black families and how abolition can build a safer world. And for me, it's that and, because for so many of us talking about abolition, it's understood as a tearing down, as a destroying, as an obliterating, and it is that, but she describes it as a way to build a safer world. And I think for those of us trying to imagine and getting ourselves out of the box of the current system that we've been working all of our careers to reform, that two-part way of thinking about the child welfare system and abolition is absolutely critical. And we thank you for your brilliance and for putting yourself out there and for sharing it with all of us. And a special thanks to Sarah Fatala. Sarah is the Senior Director of Research at Think of Us, and she's going to be our moderator tonight. Everyone at Juvenile Law Center works very quickly. Sarah is kind of another dimension. So when we talked about this event and Sixto said, I'll have her read Dorothy's book and propose some questions, I think it was 12:47, after midnight that night, that we got sort of a list of questions. And a few days later, I suggested some additional questions. I said to Sixto, I used the restroom, I came back, and the revised script was in my inbox. So we are so grateful for your preparation and also for all you bring to tonight's discussion. I welcome you all to stay. There will be time for questions afterwards, but during the course of this is really going to be a conversation facilitated by Sarah, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. So without further ado, Sarah, Sixto, Dorothy, thank you.
I'm so grateful to be here and moderate this conversation, solely because you two are some of my favorite people. You don't know this, Professor Roberts, but you are one of my absolute favorite scholars, and I read all of your books and probably a lot of your published papers online. And Sixto, from the moment we met, I so related with the vision that you have for Think of Us, which is obviously why I'm with the organization. And so I'm really excited that we're all here today to have this important conversation around something that is dear to my heart. I hope you will all get a generative sense of just thinking about this problem in a new way. So I first just wanted to kick us off by asking you both to share with the group, how do you relate to the child welfare system? What is it that you bring to this conversation?
I think you should begin.
Okay, so I'll kick it off. So, my connection comes from my personal experience in the system. I think what we know is that most young people come into the foster care system, leave within about 2-ish years or half go home at one point. But for me, I entered as an 11-month baby, was adopted by the age of 9, and that adoption was pretty abusive and racist. And so while the light-skinned children in the household got to go to a private school, I was told because I was Black I would go to a public school. They got to do things that I didn't get to do, and got to be part of that family. And eventually, by 13, I found myself couch surfing quite a bit. And at 15 is when I finally had gathered enough evidence. I had taped a recorder to my chest, gathered the evidence of abuse. It actually came from Law and Order. I was watching Law and Order, and no lie, and I realized I have to make a case. And once I was able to make the case, I came back in. And this is where I fell in love with systems change, because what I realized is that there was something so fundamentally broken about the system that it took me having to go to these extremes. It took multiple opening, closing investigations. And then finally, when I was back in the system, I kind of thought that storm was over, but yet it was a series of homes after that. It was a series of bureaucratic paperwork to get a calculator for my 8th grade, or to be able to attend my brother's funeral, which I didn't get to do. It was bureaucracy that was literally dictating my life day in and day out.
Thank you for sharing, Professor Roberts.
Yeah, well, I don't have as compelling a story as Sixto does, but I became aware of how harmful and destructive the child welfare system, which I think is better termed as a family policing system, is when I was working on my first book, Killing the Black Body, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I started writing that book because I was alarmed and outraged at the way in which Black mothers were being treated by the criminal punishment system. In particular, I was looking at the arrests and incarceration of Black women who were pregnant and using drugs. And I thought from the very beginning that I began to read stories in the paper about it, that this was punishing these women for having children, and that it was tied to a long history of devaluing Black mothers and their bonds with their children, and all sorts of really horrible stereotypes about Black families not being valuable, passing on negative lifestyles to their children. And as I was doing that research, I discovered that there were thousands and thousands of Black mothers who were having their babies taken from them at birth because of a positive drug test. And I was then even more alarmed. And also, as I started to look into it, I was in Chicago at the time teaching at Northwestern Law School. I'm sitting in family dependency court and seeing that all I saw were Black families coming before judges, mostly Black mothers and their children, or having been separated from their children, pleading to get their children back. And I saw the kind of bureaucracy that Sixto was talking about that wasn't helping anybody, was just impeding the ability of the families to get together, making them weaker, not stronger. And it was so clear to me that this was a racist system. All you had to do was spend a day in court and you would see, well, why is there a separate court for Black people? It can't be good. Can't be good. And then I began to meet Black mothers in Chicago who were trying to get their children back and also to organize in very basic ways because they had to spend all their time meeting the requirements of DCFS. They didn't have any money. They were struggling to be able to be reunited with their children, but they also knew that this was a system that was harming them and disrupting their families, not helping them at all, and that it was widespread in their neighborhoods. They could also see that everyone in their neighborhood was affected in some way by this destructive system, and they were starting to have, what in academia we'd say theories about it. Like they would say, the state kidnapped my children, or this is a form of slavery. And I began to understand it that way myself. And so I did both working with these mothers, going with them to hearings, and talking with them about their relationships with their children and why they were fighting back, and then doing research as well into how we got here and all the harm that it was causing, and developing an idea that this was not just a flaw in the system, this wasn't an aberration, but that these mothers were reflecting a fundamental design that was aimed at destroying their families and their communities. And so that's how I got into it. And then, ever since the late 1980s when I discovered this, I've been working to try to bring to light how harmful the system is, and also working with people who are organizing to dismantle it and replace it with something, an approach that truly cares for children and families.
Absolutely. I want to touch on one of the stories of the Black mothers in Chicago that I know you wrote about in the prologue of your book, Journal. It's the story of a mother whose newborn was taken away from her, and she fought tooth and nail to reunite with her child, despite complying with every single requirement that DCFS threw her way, the Department of Children and Family Services. And I know that this is a story, I spoke with Sixto before this, that you personally resonated with, and I wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, I open up the book, Torn Apart, and as I start reading the first story, it just was like this very surreal moment where I was like, holy crap, like, she's writing about my mother. When I think about the interaction with the police in that first a couple pages, and I think about all the requirements that were given to this woman to say you have to do these, drug rehab programs, you have to do this parenting, meet with the parenting coach twice a week, you have to do these things, and you still do all the things, and then it determines that it wasn't good enough based on someone's opinion. It was one of those moments where I realized, whoa, my mother's story is written in this book by another name. And in particular, what stood out to me was how the system is sometimes forcing so many times people to go into voluntary agreements. And just about 2 months ago, I got paperwork back. I submitted requests in the new year. It took a couple months. And I got paperwork back, and I just want to actually read it because there's a couple lines in this paperwork that I feel are literally almost verbatim in the actual book. But this is actually my case file. So this is July 16, 1998. With Yolanda, the treatment worker, met with client. Client was appraised of the situation and then acted very inappropriately. Client continuously yelled and swore and tried to make excuses and blame everyone else for her situation. The client was very upset and was threatening verbally and gesturally. Client eventually signed the voluntary placement form. There's nothing voluntary about this moment to place my mother placing her children in foster care. And when I asked my mother, I read this and I called her and I said, hey, tell me about this day. She's like, I finally had to, because they told me they were going to arrest me. That day, I was 7 years old, and my mother had hid us in the neighbor's kitchen cabinets. And when we came out, I saw the lines of police cars just there. And so when I think about almost every story that's in this book, there's this common perception, facade of choice. There's this data point that's in our data systems that said these are the voluntary agreements. But in reality, why qualitative research is so important is because when we dig in and we look behind that number, there was unjust control over a person. And the definition of oppression is unjust control.
Yeah, if I could say some more about how Jornel's story reveals some basic horrifying aspects, and thank you so much for that. I just feel very gratified and humbled that you saw your family in the stories I tell in Torn Apart. For me, it affirms that what I wrote is the truth about what's going on, and I think it's very helpful when researchers like me who do reach out to people. I mean, for me, I have to work with the people who are suffering from the systems I'm writing about, and I think it's so important when people who experience it can confirm that this is the truth. And also that people who are trying to minimize, and there are a lot of them out there now, trying to minimize the harms that the system does, it's harder for them to do that when there are people like you, Sixto, who can say, no, this really happens. And like you said, can bring out the experiences that are behind the statistics. Because it's so easy to hide, the depth of terror and coercion and harm and violence with the statistics that don't reveal that at all. Jornel was someone who, as Sixto says, she did everything that was asked. Even the drug treatment program, she did it twice. Right. She went through a drug treatment program twice. And these take months. So you have to understand there's a child, a newborn child in foster care, and then 6 months go by and they'll say, well, just do another program just to make sure. Then 6 more months go by. A year could go by. And then they said to her, well, you need to do a relapse program because you might relapse after the baby didn't even test positive for drugs. This was a prior drug problem that she had. And then the other thing that you pointed out from the record you read, they point out certain kinds of personality traits or behaviors that they deem to be evidence that you're not fit to have your children back. And this is so common in Black mothers' files. And also Black fathers, the assumption that Black fathers are going to be violent and not care for their children. You see this in the files. Black mothers, she was angry. Yes, she was angry because you took her children away and won't give them back, I also, when in my prior book, Shattered Bonds, I point out another mother I got to know where in her file they said she was too happy. So that proves she didn't understand the gravity of her children being taken away from her. I mean, either way, they can point out some personality flaw that seems to indicate that you're not a fit parent. And so the other thing is some kind of cognitive problem. This is what they kept saying about Jornel, that she had some kind of cognitive issue. Basically she doesn't seem smart enough to us. And these are all vague, they're not actual diagnoses, although they could get people on their payroll to make negative diagnoses as well. This one other point I want to highlight is the way in which caseworkers collaborate with police officers, and in multiple ways, but in investigations and child removals, very often caseworkers will come to homes with police, and that is deliberately to terrorize the family and coerce them into agreeing to what they wouldn't have. It's not voluntary. The idea that it's a voluntary plan is ludicrous. The idea that these are services when they're forced upon you is ludicrous, but these are the kinds of approaches that the system takes to families because it's based not in support, but in coercion and terror and threats and punishment. And so you end up with situations like this where it's almost like forced confessions in the police context, where you're forced to admit that you shouldn't have your children. And just one other thing I picked up from what you were reading is when the part that says, you know, she's not taking blame for the situation she's in. And I found that when mothers say, there's some other problem I have in my home. I didn't feed my children because I can't afford food, or I'm living in a homeless shelter because I can't afford housing. That's seen as, oh, you're not taking responsibility for your fault, you know, because this whole system is about blaming the parents for the hardships their children are facing because of structural inequalities. So when parents point this out, they know why their children don't have enough food or medical care, or their education is suffering, or they don't have secure housing. But when they point that out, it's used against them as not taking responsibility. And heaven forbid they should have an analysis that, you know, what you're doing is blaming me for structural issues. And many of the mothers I talked to had that analysis. They knew that it wasn't their fault. They knew they loved their children. They wanted help for their children and their families. But that kind of analysis was seen as failing to take responsibility, and that was another count against them and why they shouldn't get their children back.
I want to loop back also to one additional point and unpack this a bit, because, you know, there's the point of when we were earlier talking about the drug programs. We were talking about the parenting classes, and we're talking about these requirements. And I think a lot of America will hear this and say that makes sense. They'll be like, well, you had a drug problem in the past, you should probably do a drug program, even if your child wasn't, tested positive for drugs. And when I think about my mother, you know, she had the same exactly every single thing that was assigned to Janelle was the same assignments that my mother had. The drug programs, the parenting coaching, all the do it over again, the relapse program. And when I finally stopped being so angry at my mother in the situation was the moment when I learned that as a 12-year-old girl, she was being sexually abused by her stepfather. And that her mother had to make the choice of either abandoning her or leaving and not being able to provide for all of the children. And so between the age of 12, when I started to dig into the people who were taking care of my mother, where she would work at this restaurant, right? From 12 all the way to 21, my mother had not lived in a stable apartment. She was homeless in abandoned places, figuring out how to survive on the streets. And so by the time she had me at 26, the intervention here was not a rehab program or a parenting class. The intervention in that very moment was to dig deep into the trauma of that violation, to the trauma of being left, to the fact that you weren't in school between 12 and on. And so the interventions that we've developed as a system, quote, quote, and let me not say we, but the interventions that were developed by the system, you know, focus on the symptomatic behaviors of what they can measure. And yet, we still haven't figured out yet how to say, how do we support someone in the deep healing that's needed while not causing more system-induced trauma? And what this system is, what I'm starting to see, is that the level of system-induced trauma is not just high for the biological family, like the biological parents should say, but it's also high for the child itself.
The system places the blame on the individual, on the parents. We're currently doing research on the investigation experience from the point of view of the children, the teenagers that were part of that investigation. And they internalize, and another consequence of that is that they internalize the blame that they see the system place on their parents, and they and that shifts the relationship and the way that they view their parents, because they then see it as, my parent failed me.
Yeah.
And they really internalize that sense of blame, which is, again, harmful for so many different reasons. And so as we zoom back a little bit from hearing all of the punitive, the coercive nature of the system, I know in your introduction, Professor Roberts, you talked about calling child welfare the family punitive system. I know there were others that call it the family regulation system. Could you speak a little bit about why that is an important shift in language?
Sure. I think that the general public has an idea that this is a benign, benevolent system that rescues extremely abused children from their homes and puts them somewhere better. You know, there's this idea of child saving and rescuing that is very prominent in narratives about the system. And so it doesn't get the scrutiny that other systems do. It doesn't get the scrutiny that the prison industrial complex does, or that our education system does, or healthcare system. There's a sense, I think, that many people have that even if there are flaws in it, even if there's some trauma that's created, it's still better than what's happening in the homes of children who are separated from their family caregivers. And also the narrative that that's why the system exists. That's how it operates. That's its history. You know, there's narratives about all of this. The history of charitable organizations coming in to rescue children. And they leave out the history of child removal being used as a weapon of war against Native people, or family separation of Black enslaved families, or the way in which children were apprenticed to former enslavers by family courts after the Civil War. You know, the orphan trains that sent white immigrant children from the East Coast to work on farms in the Midwest and Southwest. That's not the dominant history. The dominant history is rescue, rescue, rescue. And so I think because of that, the family policing system gets a pass. You know, it gets a pass on families' constitutional rights, for example. You know, the Fourth Amendment applies to any government official that wants to search your home, not just police officers. It's supposed to get a warrant and show probable cause for the need of this search. But caseworkers and police officers routinely demand entry into people's homes without a warrant, and because of the coercion we've been talking about, most people let them in. You know, not wealthy people have a lawyer to call, and hopefully we can work on making sure everybody has a lawyer to call, right? A family defender unit they can call, but right now that doesn't exist. And so the public, I think, doesn't really understand, the majority of the public doesn't really understand how the system works, and so it doesn't get the outcry that it should based on the kinds of trauma and harms that it inflicts on families. And it also means that families are not having their rights protected. Judges routinely ignore the rights of family caregivers in the name of rescuing their children. And we continue to perpetuate this system, or I'll pick up what Sixto said, we're not doing it. But in a way, you know, if we're not fighting against it, we're allowing it to continue and inflict these harms. And the harms are so obscured because of this false narrative. And so that's why I think that the term child welfare system and child protective services and foster care all are part of this propaganda to make it seem like it's caring, it's protecting, it's improving children's welfare, when in fact it's a system that prevents us from moving toward an approach that would truly make children safer, that would truly support families, that would truly improve children's welfare. Just to cite one other kind of statistical kind of thing, the United States has the highest rate of childhood poverty of any Western nation, and it also takes away the most children of any Western nation and terminates the most parental rights of any Western nation. And I think those go hand in hand. We as a nation are ignoring childhood poverty by and large. It persists at abysmal levels despite how wealthy this nation is. And part of the reason it's ignored and there aren't radical steps to end child poverty is because the solution that this nation has to it is to take children away from impoverished families. And that's why you've got to move toward dismantling this impediment to an approach that would be truly better for children's welfare.
Thank you. Before we move to talk about abolition, because that is the meat of the conversation, I do want to name that when we're speaking to the harm and the trauma that the system causes, it does affect disproportionately families of color and Black families in particular. I've seen presentations that you've both made where the audience has reacted in a pretty shocked manner to statistics like 12% of Black children will enter foster care before their 18th birthday, or that over half of Black families will experience an investigation in their lifetime. My question to you then is this indicative of the system failing to meet its promises, or is it working as intended? I'll maybe start with you, Sixto.
I think, every systemic problem, every systemic outcome is literally by the design that it has. And so the system is working as intended. And that's just the fact, right? Like, there is a system, there are conditions, there's a way people think, there's a way money is spent, there is a way that rules are put together, and there's a way that power dynamics are there. And that produces the current outcome. And I think what happens in this situation is that we look at the system, and I'll actually rewind back to something here, an analogy here. We did a research study called Away from Home that looked at the experiences of young people in group homes. And we asked young people about their experiences in group homes, and they told us all these very horrific things that had happened to them. But then some of them were like, here are the good things. I got to eat. I had a stable place to live. I had these beautiful things in terms of I didn't have to worry about family relationships anymore because I'm exhausted from being in different homes. But the purpose of a group home, in the sense, was supposed to be that it's an intervention, right? It's just because there were good things that were named, it's flawed by the design. Because the design was that it wasn't supposed to be just a place that you sleep and have some food to eat. It's supposed to be a temporary intervention. And so even though there were good things to say about group homes in terms of food and shelter, it is the misuse of that. And so when I think of child welfare, I think about the same thing in terms of young people. I can point to, yes, I am alive today, right? Because at one point I left this very abusive situation and was put into the system, right? However, did I actually leave the system with the promise of family? No. Was I ever reunited? No. 3 years ago, I was in New York City. And my sister calls me out of the blue, and she's like, hey, do you want to go to a family reunion? And I was completely stunned that she didn't mention this before, and it's out of the blue, and thank God I was in New York City. And so ended up saying yes, we end up in Spanish Harlem or walking through the parks. And, I'm Afro-Latino, Puerto Rican, and so the family's comes in all shapes, sizes, colors, you name it. And so picking out potential family members in a park in a summer in Harlem, best to believe it was a task. And finally end up at, the family, my family. And it was a very emotional moment because, for the first time in life, I saw people who looked like me. Even though I have 11 siblings, they all look a little different, right? We all look a little different. But here, it was just shockingly obvious that I belonged to this family. And people were so welcoming, I had different fears in that moment. Would they reject me because I'm gay? The answer was no, right? Would they be like, we don't believe you're your father's son? The answer was no to that, right? And so here I am having this very profound moment. And I look and I see these 4 sibling sets, these 4 young people running around. And I'm like, oh, who are these kids? Because they weren't Puerto Rican, they weren't black, and they weren't white. They were 100% Mexican. And so I'm like, who are these children? And everybody's just like, our little cousins, our little cousins, our little cousin. And I start to dig more into the situation. And then I find out that they're foster adoptive cousins. And I actually had 4 uncles and aunts who were there, who were foster adoptive parents. And they had been fostering before I was even born. And in that very moment, there was just a numbness that came to me. And I just stopped. And I pulled out my phone, opened up my Google Maps, and mapped to my last foster home. And it was 58 miles away. So this whole time, family that I could have been living with were 58 miles away. And that made me obsessed with trying to understand, where did we go wrong here? And so that's why I started looking at my case plan. And it's one line in the case plan. Sixto refuses adoption and there's no viable transfer of guardianship. It is the line that sentenced me to not being able to live with family ever because it became the truth for every worker that had had my case after 11 months and 1 day. And that is why there wasn't a quote, quote, reasonable effort to dig into that conversation because it had been determined. And if that line would not have been written, who knows what the conversations could have been. So when I think of this system and we talk about the design of the system, it's working as intended. When you write something in these narratives, it becomes almost like the law to folks that's unchangeable. And it dictates people's behavior. It dictates how you are treated and what you get and what you don't get. And in this case, what I didn't get was ever a conversation about potential family because it was already written off. And that meant I got no family and ended up aging out.
Yeah, I agree. It's working as it was intended to work, as it was designed to work from the very foundations of the system and then through successive reiterations of it, the fundamental way it operates that is based on threatening to take children away or taking children away, accusing, investigating, punishing, destroying. That's the fundamental design of this system. And as long as that exists, and it's existed from the very foundations of it and it continues today, whatever the reforms are, okay, we'll reduce foster care a little bit, we'll have preventive services, but it's still within the context of we're going to accuse you, we're going to investigate your family, we're going to threaten to take your children away, and you must engage in these services to get them back or to keep them. There may be shifts, and there have been shifts in the foster care population in the nation, different jurisdictions, but that fundamental approach of punishment and coercion, this carceral type of logic has stayed with the system throughout centuries, actually. And I want to respond to one thing also that you said, Sixto, about the responses of some of the youth who were in institutional care. And I noted that as well, that they talked about the confinement the way in which they were devalued, the violence that occurred, the harms that they felt, the trauma they felt, but to then say, but at least I have a place to eat, that shows that the expectation they had was not that they were going to be well cared for. And that's the expectation of the system in general. You know, there's so many people who have responded to Torn Apart by saying, okay, you show all these harms in it, but not every child is harmed. You know, I was saying earlier that when I quoted the federal statistic that a third of teenagers will spend some time in institutional care if they're in foster care. Now, we should be concerned about that. It certainly is contrary to the myth that all children in foster care are placed in loving homes that care for them. And someone responded to that by saying, well, but that means 2/3 aren't. So isn't that good? Well, no, we should not be satisfied with a third are. You know, and there's this resistance to change that I see where people point out it's not as bad as it could possibly be. You know, even a study that was trying to discount the fact that Black children are more likely than white children to be placed in foster care. There are these high rates of child removal, high rates of investigation. Again, I'll repeat that statistic, that more than half of Black children in America will experience a child welfare investigation by the time they reach age 18. We should all just be outraged by that amount of state intervention into Black communities. And that is, though, despite those clear statistics, despite all the stories of harm documented, also told by people who experience it, there's this idea that, but it's not as bad as it could be, which then would suggest that Black children are being treated as if they're not valued very much. They're disposable, you know, so that any amount of benefit you might point to is the best we could hope for, and that outweighs all the harms that we know exist. That's, you know, what kind of child welfare system is that? That's not a system designed to improve children's welfare. It's a system designed to harm that then excuses the harm based on these myths and to me, the devaluation of Black families as well as other marginalized families in America.
You know, one thing I'll add to this is that, our government has special relationships with certain parts, like certain groups of its citizens. And so, like, I think about veterans, right? You know, you sign up to defend your country and you are going to be supported. We as a country believe that if you fight for this country, that we are going to make sure that you have access to education, that you have access to health care, that we are going to be there for you. And there's a culture in the Veterans Affair in the VA that, like, you know, once you're a veteran, you're always with the VA, and like the average veteran will come back for services a couple years after, and like it's a lifelong interaction. What's very interesting to me, though, is that there's another special bond that is between the government and children in foster care, because it was the government who decided that your future was at stake in your current condition. And 64% of the young people who are in care because of neglect reasons and usually tied to poverty, right? And so the government has made a promise, or at least has stated, that we're going to remove you from this situation because your future is at stake, put you in foster care, and the goal will be to reunite you when it's safe, when your future is no longer at stake. We're going to go ahead, and if we can't do that, figure out how to get you a forever family through adoption, through transfer of guardianship, etc. So the government literally becomes our parents through state and federal policy and agency rules, right? And yet, we are not treated with the specialty of that bond. The moment that the government removed us from our homes, the government itself took responsibility for our life outcome. And right now, the reason why this issue is on the floor is because no one, not one oppositional, quote, quote, call yourself a researcher if you want to, no one can say that because they have inter-child welfare, that it is an indication that their life is going to be better off. The people who are surviving foster care and the people who are surviving this are surviving in spite of, because nonprofits have inserted and said, we got you. Because people and young people's lives have come around and said, I got you. But if we were only to experience one intervention, and that is the intervention of the system, then we will not be better off. And so that is the real conversation. And because there are other interventions while you're in care that get added to the mix, whether that be a nonprofit, whether that be the community, whether that be the church, these are the interventions that are actually ensuring that we will survive in spite of the system.
That's right, that's right. So why keep the system that's only impeding these, right, these supportive ways that are better for caring for children? I so agree with you. I think that if the government is going to take children away from their families, they better show that they are doing everything possible to improve the welfare of children. And they certainly are not. They are not.
In your book, you make an extremely compelling case for it. But as with other systems, when abolition is presented, the immediate response is, well, what will replace it? What will come beyond it? And in Torn Apart, you speak to a plethora of initiatives that have sprouted across the nation, where whether it's legislative changes, whether it's community-based, voluntary, non-coercive resources, whether it's family defense, like you've mentioned earlier. Aside from it being the scary word that somehow people recoil upon hearing, what does abolition actually look like?
Yeah. And it's so interesting that it's a scary word when the history in the United States of abolition is emancipating Black people from enslavement. It should be a positive word. It's so strange to me that people find it so frightening, the word abolition. And yet we have people who want to erase that history. But abolition should have a positive ring to it. It should mean freedom. It should mean ending an oppressive system and freeing people and creating a more equal society. In the 14th Amendment Reconstruction amendments that apparently the U.S. Supreme Court wants to do away with, that freedom that's embedded in those as well. Different subject, but so abolition means both dismantling what we have now that is oppressive, that's harming people, that people are suffering right now from, and at the exact same time, simultaneously, and it has to happen, is to build something better to replace it, a better approach. It's not necessarily a system. It's an approach that, in this case, truly cares for children, truly meets families' needs, truly supports them, truly keeps children safer than what we have now. And they're both essential because the system we have now cannot be reformed. As we've been saying, it is inherently flawed. It has a flawed design. It has an oppressive design, a violent design. So the system has to be dismantled. It can't be fixed. That doesn't mean that we don't want to engage in incremental reforms to dismantle it, but that's with the vision that we're going to do without it. We're going to completely dismantle it piece by piece. We don't think that this big foster industrial complex that spends $30 billion a year on taking children away and maintaining children outside their homes and investigating and policing families, we can't tear that down anytime soon. There's so many people invested in it in multiple ways. Administrations, state, city governments that take money from children in foster care and use it to meet their budget shortfalls, and all the people employed and all the contracts with all these therapeutic agencies and all of that. But we can work incrementally to pass laws, to protest, to end certain aspects of it that are especially damaging, to shrink it. And at the same time, though, we do have to have something to replace it, because unlike what some people think abolition means, which is just tearing down the system and leave children to fend for themselves, families to fend for themselves. No, we're saying children and families need resources. They need their material needs to be met. That we do need to address violence in homes. I don't know any abolitionist who says, oh, we don't care. But the whole reason we want to end the system is because we care about the suffering that it's inflicting. We care about the huge amounts of poverty in the United States. We care that there isn't adequate housing in Philadelphia, and other cities. We care about that. That's why we want to abolish this system that is either ignoring it or making it worse. And so we need to be working toward a radically different way of meeting needs and dealing with violence in families. As Sixto was saying, what happened to his mother was just punitive and coercive. It didn't address her deep needs, either her emotional or her material needs. And that's why his family was destroyed, not because, or dismantled, whatever term you want to use. It was, what would you say? How do you say it? Sixto, I don't want to put words in. What happened to your family?
I'll take either of those.
Yeah, it was destroyed and torn apart. It was torn apart unnecessarily. And so that is just as important to build that up. And you gave some examples of increasing the support for families' rights, actually applying the Constitution to families, giving them interdisciplinary, comprehensive family defense. And I'd say interdisciplinary because it includes lawyers and social workers and parent advocates. Multidisciplinary might be a better term for it. Doing away with mandated reporting, which only limits the kind of care that doctors and teachers and social service providers and others can offer to families. It drives families away from what support they could give. It makes it hard for schools and community clinics and social service offices to provide the support that they could provide, which is too little to begin with, but even the little bit that they can provide gets ruined by them having to report on people who come to them for help. So there are all these ways we could be chipping away at the system we have now, and also freeing people who are trapped in it. I think that's really important to help, and here's where the rescue should be: rescue people from the system and reduce the suffering that it's inflicting. And then on the building up side, to invest in various ways in community-based voluntary resources of lots of sorts, whether we're talking about groceries or childcare or medical care or educational supports, different kinds of supports for people who may have drug problems. All the things that people need, human beings need to thrive. How can we make sure that people have that without having to rely on carceral systems, whether we're talking about police, prisons, or family separation. That's what we should be advocating for and helping to build up while we're ending this really violent and harmful system.
So I just want to link that, thank you so much, Professor Robert, with something that you say a lot, Sixto, which is your work is about re-architecting the system. When you hear about these initiatives, when you hear about legal defense, when you hear about community resources that support people's material conditions, how does that align with that vision that you have?
Yeah, so I think for me, there's a little internal conflict, and it's because I know so deeply what the flaws of the system is, and then I also know that when an organization decides to come out and say they are in support of abolition, that also comes with isolation. And it comes with the kind of chastising of like extremists. And so then you're like, oh, you're the other. And the reality is that we don't spend enough time actually talking about what that common goal is and what that common outcome is. I think that people in our sector have gotten so caught up with this type of conversation that they miss the point where we're talking about what is the actual practice, what is the actual intervention, what is the thing that is dramatically going to change the trajectory of someone's life and who's better off because of it. And for me, I am super obsessed about how in the world do we get to a place that when stuff has gone left in life, because life is life, how is it that you experience the interventions that will go ahead and help you heal, develop, and truly position you to thrive? And if there was ever a reason for government to intervene in the personal development, in the personal healing, in your personal capacity, that interaction should be so catalytic that you would be able to go ahead and actually see your life dramatically improve because of it. When we literally spend hundreds of thousands of dollars per child in situations that are multi-long year, that type of investment should be like, we are the rock stars of life. And yet that is not what we see. And so for me, I look at our systems, I look at child welfare, I look at the policing system, I look at the court system, I look at these different type of systems, and I ask myself, what good and what harm is being done? And my role in my organization, the one I have a full-time job at, it's about re-architecting the system, But I think the thing that I love about being, the thing I love about being part of the Juvenile Law Center board is that it is at the cutting edge of having the tough conversation about how do you dramatically think differently about this. And the stance on abolition and the stance of saying, look, this child welfare system does not work and we're willing to go lean in. I'm willing to be on that crazy ride and I can exist in both worlds. And I think that the problem is that so many people think that you have to pick one or the other, but I can be helping re-architect certain processes and at the same time be looking at what does it mean to contribute towards abolition.
Thank you so much. And I'm keeping an eye on time and wanting to have some time for questions. So my last prompt to you both is, in a few words, what would be the call to action that you want to leave the people here in this room, the people that are going to watch the recording, and particularly folks who work with the Juvenile Law Center as they think about their involvement with the system?
I would say, picking up on what Sixto was just saying, I think we can have, and we should have, a vision of something radically different. And then the question is, how do we move toward that? And so what are the kinds of actions we can take now to move toward a radically different approach to families and children that will entail some action now to, whether you want to say changing the architecture or chipping away at it or reducing the suffering. These are things we can do right now and also at the same time thinking about what might replace what we have now with a better way of truly supporting families and caring for children. And I think we can do that together. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the thing I would say is I would ask people to truly think about how do you radically center the experiences of the people that we're in service to, and how are we truly in service? Because when we follow that, you find yourself on these pathways to say, I'm challenging myself to think differently. And when you're finding yourself having to challenge yourself to think differently, being uncomfortable, then you know you're on the right pathway. Because if this was easy and these were simple-ish problems, then generations ago this would have been solved. And that's not the case. But we have more information now than ever before. We now know more than ever before about trauma. We now know more than ever before about brain science. We now know more than ever before about healing. And so how might we actually leverage, the last 2 or 3 decades where more information has been produced than the entire history of humanity, and these last couple of decades, more data points. How do we harness that to truly understand how do we actually get to families to be able to heal, develop, and really be positioned to thrive? And what that takes for every individual who gets into this battle and to get into this kind of arena to say and contribute to this, it takes us actually being willing to have real conversations, being able to say, I can look across and try to understand the different opinion that's at the table. And when we fail to do that, we actually fail to be in service.
Thank you both so very much. What a wise word to end on. Just a fierce commitment to people's lived experience and material conditions. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And should I open it up for questions?
First, I found all 3 of your presentations really just very, very compelling and very persuasive as to the bankruptcy of the system. And it's wonderful on a day that has so much negative stuff in it to hear something, it's negative, but at least it's very constructive and creative. I appreciate that. And you were very, very persuasive, as I say, as to the breaking down as to the fact that the system is broken. I didn't get as much, and you referred, Professor, at the end to a vision, that toward which we ought to work in creating that vision. I'm not sort of understanding what that looks like. I mean, if you had your druthers in a real world, what would it look like?
Yeah. Well, it would look like families would have high quality housing, medical care, education, child care, all the things that people need to thrive. They would have, this is something that didn't come up as much in our discussion, but wealthy families have problems too. They have conflicts. They have drug use in homes. They have anger toward children and vice versa. They hardly ever get into this system because they have resources to deal with their problems. And one way to think about this, I don't think it's enough, but is to make sure that all those resources that wealthy families have that allow them to avoid being in a system, which of course wasn't designed to ever have anything to do with them anyway, but that all families have those resources to meet human needs. That's part of what the world would look like. I also, though, believe that as long as we have hierarchies supported by stereotypes of white supremacy and racism, of patriarchy and sexism, of homophobia and heterosexism, and hatred of discrimination against people with disabilities, discrimination against people who are impoverished. As long as we have those hierarchies, even in this radically different society that provides at least people's minimum needs, you will still have forms of inequality. I believe that even in a system, for example, a socialist society, that where the welfare state meets all of these basic needs, you could still, because of racism, have welfare workers going in and discriminating against people based on race. We already see this in some Western European nations that have very wonderful, generous welfare states, but they're intervening into the families of immigrants from Northern Africa, for example. So, and other non-European nations. The ideal would be to both dismantle these hierarchies as well as to provide for the basic needs that people have. And I know that sounds, utopian, but I think that it's possible to have a society like that, and we certainly should be working toward it. And, if we don't see it, maybe our children or grandchildren will.
What comes to mind for me is I know what the wrong answer would be. And that would be an answer that rhymes with how things have been today. If you hear someone give you a very clear vision of what it's supposed to be with the 3 to 5 things in it, then we're off. Because that is traditionally how things have done. And we continue to go ahead and assign interventions at the most highest level, and who gets to determine that we should do that? And that's the importance of lived experience data. Lived experience is being able to co-design the interventions that really work for their own selves and their community. And so when I think about, in the simplest form to oversimplify it, anger management. At one point, anger management was an intervention that you would go to a therapist for. And then someone packaged it up, and you did your 12-step program, and I feel blank when blank happens, and you learn these things, and now there's an intervention that is created that you can go to a 2 or 3 month program, and it's evidence-based and stamped. There's so much that we actually haven't created because we haven't actually worked with the community to figure out what are those particular interventions that need to be designed and not just referred out to a catch-all, end-all, be-all. Because it's a very colonialistic thing to have a one-size-fit-all. Back in 1601, when Queen Elizabeth found herself with an issue of all these folks being poor, there was laws. It was the first law, the first poor man's law was, who was worthy and unworthy of support. And then the second one was who can work in the silent houses and so forth. And what stood out to me in this was that this was the moment I feel and I'm not a scholar, but I'm just going to go ahead and take some liberty here. But this was the moment where I was this one size all fits all. This is where it started. This idea of who's worthy and who's not. If you comply even today, the more you comply with a case manager, the more you're worthy of the right and the premier resources versus not. I don't want to risk sending you to this program because you might mess up our connection to them, right? And so those laws were literally copied from England into Virginia in the first colonies, right? And so whenever we live in this, here's what it should look like and paint that picture, we're off. I actually think we haven't discovered all the interventions that are needed. I think we understand very deeply the poverty interventions that we need because we understand poverty differently. And sometimes we know it works. It's you need food.
Exactly.
But there are much complex issues that we have yet to still design.
And I'm an alum, so I really connect with Sixto. But in my mother's experience also, so I just want to acknowledge, I think this has been a really ratifying conversation and validating for me and my family. And I don't get that often. But what advice do y'all have about us working with our colleagues in the field? Because the challenge, and you said this a little bit, and I'll be quick, but the challenge that I'm finding is that, I'm talking to my colleagues, and again, not just about abolition, but just saying how do we talk about interventions in a real way and acknowledge like who's excluded and who we still deem worthy of them? And what I'm getting is like, well, let's just put money back into the system, like the system can do it. And I'm finding it hard then to like sit in spaces with my colleagues who are, to your point, seeing me as I am breaking down their recommendations as someone with lived experience who also works on behalf of kids. They think that their intervention is better than mine, which it's not factually, but and we have all the facts, right? But they're taking it as like, well, now they don't want me in the room, but I'm actually struggling to be in the room with them. Yeah. So how do we get our own friends, because we are kind of like tearing each other down a little bit in this space? Like, how do we get to a place, not just of commonality, I think it's of acknowledgement. And I'll be frank, and this is the last thing I'll say. I do think a lot of white guilt comes up for many of my colleagues. Most of them are white who work in the child welfare field. And so then when we acknowledge the many things that you all have said, it's like complete shutdown. And so I'm just, any advice of how to navigate to get us to this place would be great.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just state some aspects of what you're asking, and then I'll turn to Sixto, who has a lot of experience probably in getting people to see things the way he does. But one thing I'm taking from what you're saying, and it also ties to what Sixto was saying about moving forward, and that is the importance of who's in the room, who really counts in terms of their knowledge and their experience, and therefore their wisdom about the way to move forward, whether we're talking about a particular intervention or whether we're talking about the type of society we want to see. And I've found, whether I'm doing work in this field or whether I'm looking at genetic testing and technologies, I happen to also be doing a lot of work in that area, and so much depends on who is seen to have authority, and it usually excludes the people, paradoxically, who are actually going to be affected. This is so true about academic research, where the researcher in the university comes up with the research design and the questions and the methods, and then goes into, West Philly, if you want to take Penn, and doesn't include the people there. The idea is, we're coming to help you, we're doing research to help you, and yet you don't include the people who know what is happening in their community, what they see as the problems, what they see as what would make things better. And so, that doesn't really answer your question. Again, I'm going to give that to Sixto, but I just want to emphasize how important that is and how that comes out of your question. And the other is the investment that people have in keeping the status quo. And this is something I've seen for a long time in reaction to some of the work I do, but here especially, the defensiveness, the unwillingness to examine what we have now, what the current practices and ideas and approaches are, and just digging in their heels to defend what we have, instead of being open to change in order to achieve what they say they want to achieve. So they're saying, we want to improve the welfare of children. Then why not be open to ideas about how to better do that? I said especially in this field, but it actually happens, in medicine as well, when you point out the racist practices within medicine, and you have doctors who get offended and they want to defend their practices, even when you show them the harm of their practices. And there needs to be a way that we can say to people, if this is truly your motivation. If you're here to heal, if you're here to help, if you're here to support, then listen to what I'm telling you or what the people you're causing to suffer are telling you about the harms that are actually happening from the way you are implementing the logics and the practices of this system. And think about why you're so defensive and why you want to defend the way things are now. It's hard work to get people to be willing to see that. But I have seen people who will say, oh my goodness, I thought I wanted to help and heal. And now I see that that's not what I'm doing. Let me join you in making a radical change. There are people who have that kind of change in their perspective. And there are people who they're so invested, they're not willing to make a change.
You know, one of the things that comes to mind is to know what game you're playing and to know what arena you're in. And so sometimes when we're in certain spaces, no matter how many degrees, no matter what your qualifications are, it is not the logical argument, because it's about attacking the belief and the mindset and the mental model. And so when you're starting there, you know, folks are not gonna, like, logic doesn't actually work, you know, and it's about actually having a collective experience, in which is how we've been able to move people. The collective experience of discovering a new set of beliefs together through it. And that's why when we wrote Away From Home, you know, during the writing of it, and Sarah Fatala led this research that was amazing, 150 pages of, you know, insights and quotes. And the reason why we spent so much time actually putting quotes toward the insights and putting stuff there is because those people's ability to do their own synthesis, it was much more important. People focus on reporting their research out on the findings, and that's actually centering ourselves. But when you center the actual people and their experiences, and you create something that allows other people to then understand the nuance of the collective people who you're supposed to be in service to, then you start to actually think about what are the new possibilities. But this is a spiritual, this is a mental actual game first, before we could start talking about the logic of, okay, should we cut a check? Should it be universal income? Or no, you have to meet these qualifications to be able to get this type of support. That all comes secondary. The first battle is figuring out how to exist in those spaces in a way that you're bringing people into a collective space. And that is actually a really big task that should be intentional and it literally should be a consent moment with yourself. Because the burden to do that is very high. And when I think about other big moments in our history, whether it be the civil rights movement and so forth, there were people who were willing to subject themselves to the violence, to subject themselves to the chastisement, to everything, right? In order so that then the other folks could be able to come in. And where this movement's at right now, we're in the very beginning, that there are some of us who are going to have to be frontline to be ridiculed, frontline to be attacked, frontline to say, I'm going to discredit you. And like when that first wave of defense will then allow for the second wave of folks, once we do all that work, to then be able to go ahead and start having much more of those conversations. But we're in the very beginning, in my opinion, of a moment in time where most of us in the world have had an epiphany, especially with this pandemic, that government has a different type of influence in my life than I had thought, and that it may not be working the way I need it to work for me, right? Everybody through this pandemic has had their moment where they're like, I wish they would make up their mind, probably, right? And so I end by saying, I think one of the most important things for us to go, as we go through this piece here, is how do we center lived experience? How does that become data, lived experience data? how does that then get converted to evidence for why we should do something differently? And then how do we actually work to make that happen?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Sixto. Thank you for taping, and thank all of you for being part of this conversation and this new conversation and this emerging movement. There is plenty of food here. Take some, share some, bring it home, continue the conversation, bring some cookies and have a conversation with other people around your own kitchen table. And we look forward to working with all of you as we continue moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.